Welcome to Puck Talk CS. I'm Chives alongside Steve O. Steve, how are you doing today?
I'm doing fantastic, Chives. How about you?
I'm good. The New York Rangers had a recent losing streak. They haven't been the best to start January 2024, a decade since the last time they went to the Stanley Cup final. They have their eyes on the prize this year after a strong start. Have a little bit to fix up, and we'll get into all that and news and more here on Puck Talk CS.
Love it. What an intro. Let's jump right in. Let's talk some puck. And we got to start, listen, on a positive side of things, because listen, there's a lot. You watch this team the last 2 weeks, there's not a lot to be happy about. Some certain things, but overall, I mean, it's just been terrible. But we'll get into that. Vincent Trocheck named to the NHL All Star game. Listen, he's been a fantastic player. I said this, he was my player last year that I said that he was, I think I don't recall if we said I don't think we said best, but I think most surprised player. He was my player, and listen, he's been fantastic, Chives, across all aspects of the game. You look at it, he's been fantastic on faceoffs. I mean, that is an element that we needed to improve on coming into the season. And you look at it in the games that we really dominated in the faceoffs. I mean, the beginning half, first 2 months, we were fantastic. And I believe that he's one of the only players in the NHL have more than 40 points and more than 60 hits. So all around, his game is very complete, which I love.
Complete game. I love that, Steve. You know why? I think you very rarely see a player like that get anointed into the All-Star weekend. Now, granted, we all know the history of it. Started in Toronto as a fundraiser for Ace Bailey, who died. It's turned into the NBA style of like the slam dunk contest. It went through that era. The format's clearly not working for all the big leagues in the American sports with all-star events. So really it's more of just it's an event to really just showcase, show off. It's kind of like a charity thing in that sense. And I think it's nice to see a player that's earned it step in. Joe Micheletti had said it actually before the last home game on the Jumbotron. He and Sam Rosen talked before the game, and he said more than once, this is a player that has earned a position to be an all-star, and he is a star for this Ranger team. For all my paisans out there, we're Italian, Steve-O. Trocheck Italian guy. He has the big dinner whenever they're out there in Pittsburgh with his home and family. And the, everybody I talk to is like, Trocheck's my guy. And I think that's a good sign if you're the guy in New York amongst a lot of talented players, Shesterkin, Panarin, Zibanejad, Chris Kreider, Adam Fox. You go down the list, the top end talent, and he does it all. And it's something I think Will Cooley is learning from him. He's living with him. It's like his billet family. They play a very similar style, and they're two players that are delivering for the Rangers this year.
Yeah, and listen, we knew it was not going to be Panarin, even though it should have been hypothetically, but due to his circumstance, it's not going to be. So listen, if it's not going to be Panarin, next man up, it's obviously Trocheck. So you got to be happy for him and hope he continues.
Yeah, Steve, I wanted to mention too. Let's take a look back now. The Rangers just played the Anaheim Ducks, Ryan Strome. Steve-O, the deal's got to be paying off in dividends now. There was a toss-up. Do you keep Strome? Do you keep Kopp? Or do you bring in Vincent Trocheck? And Trocheck seemed like a player that was on their radar for a long time. They signed Trocheck, and I thought last year he didn't mesh very well with Panarin. And I think that was not the best start in New York for him. He played really well, but I don't think it was the best start in New York he could ask for. Now, what do you think? I mean, compared to what you thought at the time to now.
Yeah, obviously, I think any Ranger fan can tell you who's better and who's lived up to that aspect of the deal. And listen, we knew Ryan Strome wasn't going to be a long term option here. He just wasn't. Again, fantastic player, but just wasn't the type of player we needed here in New York. He didn't live up to his expectations, and he had flaws. I know that we weren't major, supporters of his here on the podcast, or at least I wasn't. But at the time, he kind of fit. The position that we needed, but obviously we knew that it wasn't a long term scenario. And again, going back to Trocheck last year, I thought he wasn't as complete as he was last year than he is now. He's improved on a lot of his aspects of his game, but what he's done is he's been able to learn in that first year last year, and he's been able to kind of transition to the things that he needed to improve on. and take that into this year and improve and make it better and make it more of a complete game. And I love his aspect. He's been very physical. He's been scoring any opportunity we need to him. He's been better on the forecheck. Again, all aspects. And of course, he's fast as hell. I mean, he really is. When you watch him, I was watching him fly up and down the ice in that Carolina game. He's a fast guy. But again, those are all elements that we needed him to bring together. And I think, quite frankly, we made the right move. We made the right move. I don't think there's any debate on that.
Filip Chytil was in that 2C role. He was the Rangers' second line pivot, and Chytil is now on his way back to the United States in a report from Emily Kaplan that surfaced last night. So with Filip Chytil returning, the conversation I think starts, and it also starts with the fact that the Rangers are playing in San Jose. With Filip Chytil's return, does he come back this year? We could speculate, but it's just a good sign that he's coming back, right? And he's going to be in New York. It seemed like when he went back to Czechia, it was going to be a longer term thing. And it's been a few weeks and he's already ready to return. He trained with Jaromir Jagr. He's trained with the mental health and hockey coach. So I think the progress and all the signs are there and it's good. It's just taken a long period of time to ensure that he's in good health, right?
For sure. And what really curiates me, and Laviolette, said in one of his answers that, this was a new approach, in terms of what went into his rehab into coming back. And again, I'm curious into that fact. We'll probably never find out. Um, but just that he's coming back, I mean, you can't expect him to, to be right inserted back into this lineup, within the next 2 to 3 weeks. That I don't really see happening, but it is encouraging. And I really think that this could really um alter kind of the plan that Jury has in place for the trade deadline for
Mhm.
sure. Depending on what his timetable is. And I think once he gets back and the Rangers evaluate and sit down, they'll have a better timetable of when he's going to return. So I definitely think, listen, once he's healthy, and obviously when he comes back, he's not going to be 100% ready to go. But again, he's somebody that we've missed. We missed Kako. We've missed Kako was interesting. I'll touch on that later. But Chytil is definitely a player, we missed, especially looking at that Vegas games, that LA games where just offensively we've had nothing. So is that certainly promising for Chytil to come back.
Yeah, and he becomes an addition from within, right? Like he automatically adds to your team. 7 goals in that conference final run. He put up 22 goals, 23 assists, 45 points in 22-23 last season. He put up 6 assists in 10 games played this season before going down. He's now 30 plus games he's missed since November 2nd when he was hit by Esper Foss, suffered an upper body injury, and he signed that 4x4.4 March 29th, 2023. So the fact that they just signed him, right, it seemed like a deal that would become a steal at a point, right? Maybe not a steal in the same, I don't know if you could classify it as that, but it's something that the deal looks better as the term goes on, right? Like if he's signed by 4.4 and he keeps growing, well, you're in a good spot for a few years. Same with Alexis Lafreniere. Right now, Lafreniere is kind of making less than what he's producing and making on a deal that at least for this year and next year, will save the Rangers as a bridge. So I'm really excited to know what's going on with that. And Arthur Staple even had stated, I think Brooks as well had stated that, it's probably going to be sooner than later. He may even start skating with the team before the All-Star break. So that would be within the next 2 weeks. Huge news for the New York Rangers that, like you said, trade deadline's coming up. You know, he automatically checks off 3C role, right? Like I think when he comes back, he would probably play in the third line center position. And with that, just want to touch quickly upon the fact that the Rangers play in San Jose, Steve. Former third round pick Anthony Duclair, 2013 draft, had to find his way in the NHL and has. He contributed to the Florida Panthers Stanley Cup final run with 4 goals and 7 assists in their 20-game run last spring. Signs with the San Jose Sharks team that he knows is going to struggle. Has 8 goals, 8 assists in this season in 42 games for 16 points, and his maximum skating speed, according to NHL Edge, is 23.32 miles an hour. He's in the 96th percentile, so he's a speed guy. And this is what I envision. Imagine a world where Phil Chytil comes back and you go and acquire Anthony Duclair for help at right wing. I mean, is anyone complaining? I feel like that changes the whole identity of the third line.
Yeah, obviously there's a big question mark with Hito in there, but I'll raise a different element to this situation, and I'm going to toss the question back at you in a second, so be prepared. But listen, he's only on pace what to get 30 points this year, and obviously this isn't his best year, and quite frankly, this might be his worst year in the league. And again, he's not playing on a talented Sharks team. I mean, this Sharks team is highly uncompetitive. Quite frankly, they were competitive against us when we played them, and hopefully that's not the case when we play them again. But listen, the element to that, the element in Duclair's game that might be an issue is 5-on-5 play that I've seen this year. And you could toss that up in that, you know what, the Sharks are just not a 5-on-5 play. It's not him, it's the system. But Duclair struggled on 5-on-5 play this year, and that's also an area that we struggle with as well. So, do we want to add a player that is struggling to an element that our overall game we're struggling as well? So I'll toss it back to you. Do you think? I mean, I don't have the numbers in front of me, but I do know the last time I looked at them, they were not good. Duclair's numbers 5-on-5. Would you want to go out and acquire a player that is struggling in an element that overall as a team we are struggling with right now? Or do you think it's just, listen, the system in San Jose is just not competitive hockey?
Yeah, I think we talked about news. We just talked about some of the news that's going on in the Rangers world, and I think it is time to rip off the Band-Aid. They haven't been good in January. They haven't been good down this stretch. Now, since January 1st, the Rangers on the power play have 7 goals, 5 versus 4. So that's on the power play. That's ninth in the NHL. Great. Penalty kill. 74.1% on the PK since January 1st. That's 26th in the NHL. And 5-on-5, 29 goals for. That's 16th in the NHL. And 20 goals 5-on-5, so that's 16th in the NHL. My apologies, 29 goals in that time span. So with that, I think that is a very valuable question to raise because Duclair plays 15 minutes a night. I'm assuming if he were to ever come into the fold in New York, he would not be earning power play time if at least on power play one. I think a player like Alexis Lafreniere would earn the look over him. Maybe Kako, if you want a player that's like more of a puck possession playmaker with the first power play unit. If you're that first power play unit's not getting shuffled, right? Good question though, Steve. I think it's interesting. What about his game to you? It doesn't stand out 5-on-5 production or just the way he's playing.
Well, I think his puck movement has been down just in general these last couple of years. I found out. Just pulled up these stats here. So Anthony Duclair on 5-on-5, and this is per 60 minutes of play for a season. So in 2021 to 2022 season, his primary shot assists he averaged around 12. 2022 to 2023, he averaged around 15. This year, he's averaged around 5. His rush shots in 2021, 2022, he was averaging around 12. Last season, he was averaging around 15. This year, he's only averaging around 3. Controlled entries. He had 13 2 years ago. He had 19 last year. This year, he only has 8. Um, I'm not going to look at scoring chances and those numbers because, again, the Sharks are an uncompetitive team and they're obviously not a playoff team. They have their flaws in that sense. But listen, I'm not going to go through all these stats, but it's evidently clear that he's taking fewer shots this year. He's driven to quality areas of the ice less this year. Um, and listen, those numbers are concerning, but he might work he might work. I'm kind of with you in the sense that he's definitely a player that we should look at. Obviously with the skill level you've seen 2022, 2023, and 2021, and when he was with Florida, and when he's in a system that is supposed to work and ours is supposed to work, even though it's not working right now. You could see the positives that he brings to his game. And I think that there is an ability where he can turn around and create off the rush chances that I do like that he brings to the table. So again, I was just bringing these up to play devil's advocate, but I think it's clear that his consistency this season is not there. But given the season aside, there is obviously no doubt that he has the skill there that could obviously fit pretty well for us. So that's definitely an option that Jury is going to look at for sure.
Yeah, now here's where I like Duclair's game. I think he's really good off the rush, and I think that's something that the Rangers need in someone to be able to back check, to be responsible, and to be able to chip in, right? You don't need a third line guy to produce like crazy, but he's 28 years old. I also think part of it is that he's not like he of every story I've seen from Max Miller, the hockey news, he's a reporter for the Sharks, is that he's mentoring, but I also don't think he's a player that should be in a position to necessarily be mentoring. At 28 years old, young, one of the faster players in the league, he should be on a cup contending team, driving a team to the Stanley Cup, being on a third line of a New York Rangers, being on a third line of the Boston Bruins. That's what he was in Florida. Florida won the President's Trophy and had one of the highest goal production rates ever in NHL history. And then the next year, they're kind of counted out. They bring in Matt Tkachuk, and he helps lead them to the Cup, and he was a crucial part of that. So I do think part of that's his role in San Jose, and I think that transition game is something the Rangers are having a problem with is outside of the second line. And I think they could use him as a complement either on the first line or in a third line right wing position. And that's my case for Duclair.
I love your take on that right there. I mean, that obviously that plays to what I just said about his numbers being on the decline this year. And
Mhm.
listen, if we're going to use him and approach him, the player that he was with Florida, I think he works great in the system, Chives. I mean, when he's not relied on to be the primary player on the line, I think that's what we need him for, and I think that's when he's at his best, when he's counted on to help drive offensive plays with puck control within our zone, and then of course the neutral zone. I think he's great off that, and I think that when you pair him with a strong forechecker that makes plays to extend possession time, which I think we definitely do have some dogs that do that on our team. I think he's fantastic. I think he should work pretty well, but we cannot rely on him to come in and be, the offensive player to drive change, because that's not going to happen. And we'll jump into some of those issues that we're having right now. But I love that take. I love it.
I mean, how would we feel about a Will Cooley, Phil Heedle, Anthony Duclair type of line, right? I'll tell you, Steve-O, I think this is an issue that the Rangers are having, and I want to ask you, what is your opinion about the third line? Uh, we know the situation the first line's in, and despite that, Kreider and Zibanejad are still producing well. The second line, untouched. I mean, they're one of the best offensive lines in the NHL. The third line, I have questions and reserves about because I think the fourth line, when they are able to be in full and there's the injuries are all kind of dwindle away and it's pit like Goodrow VC. I love the way they shut down and generate offense on the forecheck. The one soft spot I think this team has is the third line, and every team needs a third line to win a Stanley Cup. So, Steve-O, third line, Will Cooley, they came up big in Anaheim, but on this, in the last stretch, with the rotation of Benino, Brodzinski, what has your opinion been about their identity?
This is, I think, our main issue right now. And there's a lot. You just mentioned that game against Anaheim. Quite frankly, yeah, I'm happy that they were able to show up. But quite frankly, Anaheim is not a good team. So at the same time, we shouldn't have even been in that situation in the first place. And that first period, first two periods was kind of hard to watch. on all aspects of the game. But again, this third line, and I know that i- in the first month and a half, you brought a lot of, you brought a very interesting view on this line. Whether it's Brosnitsky in there, whether you're moving Benino up, having Blake Wheeler in there, obviously Will Cooley, and I think Will Cooley's been awesome this year. I think we could both agree on that end, and I don't think that he's the problem on this line. I'm going to
Mhm.
turn towards players like Tyler Pitlick. I kind of changed my stance on him. I'm not big on Tyler Pitlick. I don't think, um, yeah, obviously he's a role player and he's not what's wrong with this team, but he's not the solution either. And neither is Johnny Brosnitsky. I know that you kind of liked him. What was your nickname for him?
Johnny Broadway.
Johnny Broadway. Well,
Hey.
quite frankly, Broadway is not the solution to I think the equation either. Again, I don't hate him, but when this team is struggling and you take a look at it, let's break it down. Let's take the Kings game, for example. We lose 2-1. You could evaluate that game in a couple different ways, Chives. And obviously, I think the main thing for us is we didn't generate enough scoring chances. Obviously a Lafreniere was able to tip one in. Um, but listen, aside from Panarin, Trocheck, and Lafreniere, I think those have been the big three in terms of production this year. I
Mhm.
mean, who do we count on for a spark? And I don't think, again, you can't look at that fourth line in terms of an offensive spark. That's not their role. Tyler Pitlick, um, Jimmy Vesey, these guys are not there for offense. That's not their identity. So that kind of brings me back to your question, the identity of this third line. What is their identity? Because I feel like, the way that some of these lines are being shuffled in and the way that the third line is performing, I can't really pinpoint what their identity is because on some nights, I want to say it's something else, and then on other nights when Panarin's line is not cooking, it's kind of like, oh, maybe we're relying on them to provide a spark, but that's really not their identity. I don't see, you know, Johnny Broadway as somebody that's going to be creating that spark. So again, I definitely think we have an issue with that third line. And I do have a question for you, but I'll toss it back to you.
Yeah, I think Brodzinski, I like him a lot. I like what he brings. I like the energy he brings. He's got a scorer's touch. They put him in his position to succeed, and he has. Um, I don't view him as a player that's just a fill-in until they acquire someone else. To me, Brodzinski has brought more to the table than a player of Blake Wheeler. Um, for a majority of the season, Capo Caco, and I'm a big Caco guy. Just in terms of his game, what he brings, how unique and different it is. It's a three-dimensional game. But I think Brodzinski's brought more over the course of his stint here since Chytil went down and Kako was injured right November 2nd and November 27th. And yeah, I with that though, I also find part of that has to do with the center position. You have Nick Bonino there, and now you have shifted Brodzinski in there. They're missing the center on that line, and the center a lot of the time is dictating play. He's controlling that middle lane of the ice, and you saw when Hedel went down, you had Trocheck to replace him, and you literally had a 2C to replace the 2C. Like you had a guy way more than capable of stepping up into that position. And with the third line, you don't. And on top of that, you have question marks with Blake Wheeler, and you have an AHL top scorer on that line. And I love the way Brodzinski's played, but that's also who he is, that he's the captain of the Hartford Wolfpack. So at the end of the day, I think that line is impacted the most. And like you're saying, there's an identity of the other three lines. Even with the first line not fully there yet, you want them to peak later on anyway. You want Chris Kreider, Mika Zibanejad to get hot going into the playoffs. You never know if that'll happen. That's what you're hoping for based on the way the season's gone. Relying a lot on the second line in transition offense, fourth line, shut down, create on the forecheck. Third line, not sure. And part of that's going to be with the news with Phil Chytil. And I think that's what makes the news exciting about Phil Chytil. But for now, it also makes a lot of questions with the trade deadline. And I think sometimes you also don't necessarily want that. You want a guy to internally come in and kind of levy that and put it to rest. Just keep it status quo and quiet the noise, because I think right now there is a lot of noise in the Ranger fan community as to what's going on there. Will Cooley's the staple on that line. I just wrote for the Hockey News. Like, he's the quintessential third liner, and he's a player that can help you win the Stanley Cup. He's probably one of the more prominent forwards on the team, and he made the team out of camp this year. So,
I agree with that. And that's why I said, in my opening remark on this point that, Cooley is staying. I think he's been fantastic. And when you look at his expectation, he's exceeded that on every level. So I think he's a mainstay as well. I'll touch upon a guy that I didn't just touch upon that you mentioned, Blake Wheeler. What is his expectation moving forward? Because he really has not lived up to it. And I know and we weren't the only ones in the offseason. I think we gave Blake Wheeler in our offseason grade. I don't recall, maybe like a B plus or an A minus. That's he's been in like a low tier C minus. Approaching the bottom tier rankings. I mean, he has just not been the intended thought when we brought him in this year. And I think, the question is when addressing this third line, what is his role? Because he's bounced around like a ping pong ball this season, Chives. What is the identity for him?
yeah, I really see if they acquire a player at the deadline that he becomes your extra skater in the playoffs. And I think at this point, that's a healthy spot to be. I think it's a role he can take on. He's a veteran. Um, he's going to compete every night to be in the lineup, but I just think right now, um, he's not producing enough, right? And it was a low risk move because the team just didn't have the capital to sign another right wing or trade for another big market right wing. Um, with that said, I think that's a positive way to look at it, especially moving forward. But the reality is, something I'm also gaining the sense of is that the Kraken win. Wheeler scores 2 goals. They have a really good shift. Adam Fox praised them after the Anaheim game. So did Laviolette. I Even if they start producing a little bit more, I just don't think they're a Stanley Cup winning third unit. Um, I don't think they're third. We just talked about that at length, and he's part of that. He contributes to that. And he's also contributed to how, I don't think Kreider and Zibanejad have played to their peak. And I think part of that's because they need a complementary winger. And now you've seen more than once this season, he's shuffled off that line and shuffled back on and shuffled off. And the hop between the first right wing spot and the third right wing spot, he's played some fourth line minutes too on the fourth line. I think not really knowing where he fits into the lineup affects a few other things. And I don't think it's like a heavy statement to say that. I don't think that that remark has anything heavy attached to it. It's not like it's got an anchor sinking the team into the ocean, and it's also not pointing everything at his situation. It's just, with the first line right wing spot, the third line right wing spot, who's the player playing in those positions? And why does the third line not have an identity? And why does the first line right wing spot seem to be a rotating door? Because if he was solidified, this wouldn't be the conversation or the discourse, and that's just the reality of it. So I do think moving forward, what they'll probably do is come around trade deadline time. They're got to look for something. You can't settle with what you have right now, and I think he is a leader, was a captain of a team. Is he going to compete as an NHL skater to stay in the lineup? 100%. Um, and he has that compete within him. He has the skill level. It's diminished, but it's there. I just think right now he'll be better served the team as kind of like what Jonathan Quick was in Vegas. A veteran goaltender, you bring him in, he plays a little bit down the stretch, guy goes down, he can fill in for game here and there. And come playoff time, he'll be a black ace. And I think for his contract and for what he's shown across 40 games this season, that's how it's going to be.
You mentioned it. Come playoff time, he could be, or come trade deadline time, he could be the odd man out. And eventually, when we come to the playoffs, man, that is a huge, the complete opposite. of what we thought his role would be coming into the season. I mean, it's been a
Yeah.
huge disappointment, and quite frankly, I think when you look at disappointment so far this season, I think that Blake Wheeler is definitely up top that list. Paired with Blake Wheeler, you could put Phil Hito up there as well. Obviously, we had high expectations for him coming in, especially right off the bat. It was made clear that Laviolette was going to set this tone with the younger guys, with Lafreniere and Hito. And Lafreniere came out and did it. And unfortunately, Kako got knocked down at one point, and Hito too. That kind of stinks. Now you mentioned Kreider and Zibanejad. Now Laviolette against the Ducks, shuffling these lines. The team was down 2-0 on Sunday. It was ugly. We couldn't get anything going. Capo Caco seemed like he was the odd man out. I think he only played like 8 minutes or so.
Mhm.
Um, Now, Laviolette, of course, didn't go into the reasons why he was quote unquote benched, you could call it. But maybe this is a hint that the Laviolette doesn't feel like Kako is the right person alongside Kreider and Zibanejad, trying to get them a spark to get going here. Do you think, Chives, that Laviolette in that last game is saying, you know what? Maybe Kako isn't the fit for Zibanejad and Kreider?
Yeah, I think something that is interesting and I've seen toyed around on the internet is moving Trocheck up and Zibanejad down, which isn't even an up and down move because one, I think they're playing really producing similarly. And I think second to that is that the first and second line, they've been interchangeable for years. It's not a first and second line. It's just like the D pairs, right? Like no matter which one's out there, they're a first line caliber trio. And I think it would be a good move maybe to get Trocheck and Kreider some looks. I like the chemistry they had for some stints last season. Um, and I liked what they've shown in the past with each other. And I think you got to get Zibanejad going. I don't think it's a matter of Kako, to be honest with you. I think my apologies. He was the it was a result of penalty kill power play time that he was shifted off the ice. And with that, I think could it, I don't think it's hinting towards anything, but I do think it's also brings up the conversation that if Kako was sitting for that time, and there were a lot of penalties, there were like 6 penalties in that period, and he was the odd man out because there's penalty kills and power play, and he's not on the power play unit, and Zibanejad and Kreider are. They're penalty killers as well, so now they're not going to be skating at even strength. So now Kako's out there with different guys. I totally see what Laviolette said with that and trust in that. But I also think there's no other side of that conversation if their line is producing well or if like fans really felt that Kreider and Zibanejad are driving the bus. And I think that has been a problem all year. I wouldn't say a list, this must be addressed problem, but I do think it's something that along the course of the year, I don't think anyone has stated that Chris Kreider and Mika Zibanejad have really driven the bus in terms of production or those big moments. Not knocking their play by any means. I think Zibanejad's a point per game center. Um, Kreider is on a scoring run that will probably see him pot 40 or close to 40 like he did last season. I've just felt that the 21-22 season and for points last season, those two were the guys kind of driving the bus for the team. And I've said this before on the podcast. I think it comes down to I think it's their responsibility because I think Kako is not a player that you can expect right now to just take his game from here to here, right? We saw with Lafreniere, it takes time, right? So yeah, I don't think it's a matter of trying some new things out, but I wouldn't be shocked if in the next week we maybe see a shuffle up. I know that would be a big change, but I'd like to see if maybe a new look just to get those guys boosted and started, even if it's just in the middle of a game. Move Trocheck up, move Zibanejad down to play with Lafreniere and Panarin, and move Trocheck, and his game fits and meshes well with Kreider. So I know that was a long response, Stevo, but I want to know what you think because now that Cat goes back, I think he's looked good. I like his game. I like what he brings. But I know that's not in the same vein as the rest of the Ranger community. So,
Yeah, Listen, I think the take was spot on, and this might be the best time to move Trocheck. Obviously we mentioned not the fact that he's made the All-Star game, but he's playing such a complete game at such a high level right now, all aspects of the game. Maybe that's a play you want to slot up and move up. Maybe try and move Zibanejad down and see what if he could get someone cooking there. And obviously there's no doubt that Trocheck could play on the top line. But I want to throw this stat at you, Chives. You know, in a regular season game where Kreider and Zibanejad both scored a goal, the Rangers are 42-11-6. There's no doubt that when these two guys, you could call them our two of our top, three guys on this team, four guys on this team, when they score and they run the table, I mean, we are a hard team to beat, and I think that's what makes our fourth line, especially you could throw our third line in there, when Zibanejad and Kreider take over these games, it makes our third line their job so much easier. And I think that could be part of the issue why this third line is struggling is because the top line isn't, I don't want to say they're not doing their job, but they've been very inconsistent, and compared to past years, Zibanejad and Kreider are not taking over games. I mean, when was the last time this year that you could think of that Zibanejad and Kreider have taken over a game? See,
I'll,
so
yeah, I'll say probably the Boston game and like post Thanksgiving, maybe Flyers. They played the Flyers around then too.
yeah, and that was over 2 months ago. So that doesn't play into our fact. And again, that makes our third line work harder. It also makes our third line, it kind of changes their identity a little bit because they have to compensate of what we're missing. And again, maybe we're asking the third line to do something that they're not equipped to do. That's not their role and that's not their identity in this team. And maybe that's kind of an element that, we have to address, but I do agree with you that this third line, is a problem. We cannot roll the dice with Blake Wheeler. He's given you some good performances here and there. You mentioned that Kraken game. But for me, and I'm sure you and all other Ranger fans listening, that's not a staple of confidence to move forward, especially towards the playoffs. I don't want to take that gamble because let's be honest, quite frankly, Blake Wheeler 90% of his games, 85% of his games this year has been ineffective, and he's made a lot of sloppy mistakes. He just looks slow out there, so I don't want to take that risk. And I agree with you. I think if we were able to acquire, let's get Hedo back and let's see who Drury brings in. If it's somebody on the wing, if it's a center, for the bottom six, let's see who he brings in. And I quite frankly, I agree. When you look at everybody's role, Wheeler might be the odd man out, for sure. But in terms of that, Kreider and Zibanejad, I think we have to get them going at some point this season. You want to see it, and again, there's just something. It's just not there, Chives, this year. You see that pop with Kreider and Zibanejad. I just haven't seen them, jump in and take over a game. You just haven't seen it.
I agree, and I think that's something that's actually been a problem for the Rangers overall. At the time you're listening, I'm sure the San Jose Sharks game. Listen, that's either a game that's like, by the time you listen, they either won or they lost and the world's ending. But with that, Steve Alquette on MSG said that every week there's going to be one game where the Rangers, it's a big game. And I found that fans, the most they react is to that big game. The smaller ones here and there, okay, run of the mill, um, Vancouver, Vegas. There's games lately that the Rangers have lost that have started a lot of discourse. And that game this week, again, is going to be against Vegas on Friday at home. We have a special guest, Dan D'Uva of the Vegas Golden Knights radio to break that game down a little bit, to do a little bit of a preview and to talk about what's going on with Vegas since the last time the Rangers met them last Thursday. Puck Talk CS has a very special guest to introduce, a Jersey boy like your own here on the podcast, Dan D'Uva, Vegas Golden Knights radio, Syracuse and Fordham alum, covered the Syracuse crunch when some of the Tampa Bay Lightning's top players were there. Fortunate enough to be in Vegas to witness a Stanley Cup. Dan, how are you doing today?
Matthew, Steve, I'm terrific. A pleasure to be with you. Thanks.
I love the voice. I think any of our listeners will recognize it, especially because the Rangers played out there just last week. A lot of what we're talking about today will be geared towards that. But I do want to hear a little bit about that story you were just telling us about with George McPhee, I believe, bringing the Stanley Cup to West Point.
George is here. Kelly McCrimmon is here. And George McPhee, people forget, was a hell of a tough hockey player, was with the Rangers, was with the Devils. And it was Lou Lamoriello who encouraged George to get his law degree at Rutgers in Newark. And then that started his journey into hockey management. And first job was with the Canucks as the assistant GM of the Syracuse Crunch when they started in 1994. Fast forward all these years later, and George tells the owner of the Syracuse Crunch, Howard Dolgan, hey, I think your guy Dan is in a good spot for that play-by-play opening we have. so those connections from the early 90s, and my first job was with the Devils organization, so Lamoriellos have been good to me. George McPhee has been good to me. And then I think that George was in a good spot when he was hired by Bill Foley, the Golden Knights owner. Bill was not in sports, but he knew a lot of people in hockey. And when he got the expansion franchise, he targeted George McPhee, who at that point had been let go by Washington, was helping out with the Islanders. And boy, what a perfect choice it was for Bill Foley to make George McPhee initially president and now, initially general manager and now president of hockey operations. So Bill Foley is a West Point graduate, and he is very proud of that. Everywhere you go in the Golden Knights practice facility, there are Douglas MacArthur quotes and references to the military history of our country.
That's cool.
Bill has been very generous in donating to West Point. There's a building named after him there. So Bill has brought the team, the Stanley Cup, management, coaches, folks to West Point to show them around. And I believe Bill Foley even wrote a letter of recommendation for Keegan Colasar's brother, Keegan Colasar, who plays for the Golden Knights, to go to West Point. So he's very proud of his alma mater. But Bill Foley is, he's the guy who said playoffs in 3, cup in 6. Well, they made the playoffs in 1, but they made the cup in 6.
That is truly incredible. I think something that we don't have the opportunity a lot to talk with is Western Conference teams, broadcasters, writers. We're so stuck in this metropolitan vacuum because of how good the divisions become for the New York Rangers and their opponents. Now, with that, I want to start off with talking about what's something that fans outside of Vegas should not only know, but fear about this Vegas Golden Knights team. A lot of the conversation has been about a potential back-to-back Stanley Cup final berth. A lot of people, I talked to Dan Rosen a lot in the box at MSG at Press Row, and he says there's not many teams that can compete with them. So what's one thing that stands out to you that's people should know, but also fear?
The things that are troubling, for example, the New Jersey Devils, since the Knights just played the Devils and lost 6-5 in overtime, compared to the same things troubling the Golden Knights. How do you respond to injuries? Vegas is its captain, Mark Stone, had 2 back surgeries in a year. Right now Vegas is without Jack Eichel, without William Karlsson, without Shea Theodore. If you were to make a list of the players you would least want out of the lineup, those would be among the 3. They got Adin Hill back after missing 25 games. And he, of course, was the goaltender who won the Stanley Cup last year. But when you're without your top players, the foundation is revealed. And so the Golden Knights are succeeding. They've got points now in 5 straight, 4-0-1. They are doing it without those guys. And it reveals how fundamentally sound they are. Frankly, how good of a coach Bruce Cassidy is. And the experienced guys, the leadership there, they can be fundamentally sound. They don't have to win flashy. They often do, but they don't have to. And, the Devils, Lindy Ruff has talked about, as an example, the Devils being as young as they are, they do have injuries, of course, but they have to find different ways to play and different ways to win because they're without so many guys. The Golden Knights don't do that. They are good regardless of whether Jack Eichel, William Karlsson, Shea Theodore are in there or not. That's what's scary. They are good right now. They have been in first place much of the year. They teetered a little bit, but they have figured things out, even with some absent players. So if you've got a great structure and you think about those guys who are all expected to return at some point, those are like trade deadline acquisitions. Boy, that is what's scary, that this team could be better than they are right now, and those players would theoretically be rested to go into a long postseason run, like, for example, Mark Stone was, Aiden Hill was. Those guys were injured for the second half of last year, and then they had great postseasons.
Now, you just mentioned some of those injuries. Can you go a little bit more in depth in terms of who stepped up for these players and some of the lineup changes that the Knights have?
Jonathan Marchessault, the Conn Smythe winner, has, to me, been the most impressive, not only because he's, on pace for a new career high in goals, but he's as fiery and as vocal and as passionate about the game as anyone I've ever come across. He was undrafted. He played for Patrick Roy with the Quebec Remparts, and credits Patrick for making him the person and the player that he has become. Jonathan said that, I thought I liked hockey, and then I met Patrick Roy. And their relationship was volatile, but mutually beneficial. So Jonathan loves Patrick Roy, very close friends with his sons, in particular Frederick. And Jonathan's spark and his dynamic with Bruce Cassidy. Jonathan and Bruce can yap at each other, but they all know it's for the betterment of the team, to the degree that Jonathan has said in coaching his own little kids that he actually uses Bruce Cassidy as an example for himself on how to coach his kids. So if you see Bruce and Jonathan yelling at each other on the Golden Knights bench, they might really be fired up, but they have a huge mutual appreciation. That's what's fun about that dynamic. And he leads the team in goal scoring. Mark Stone has been so impressive. He's a point per game. And that's, overtaken Jack Eichel now, the team lead in scoring. So those guys have stepped up. Of late, Nicholas Watt is playing in Jack Eichel's spot between Ivan Barbashev and Jonathan Marchessault. Nick Watt was a Calder Cup champion in the American League for Charlotte. Vegas got him in the Eric Howlett trade a few years ago. And he's been a fourth-line center, has had spot duty up in the lineup. But in the last two nights' games against the Devils and the Islanders, he's got 5 points combined. And he's been great in the face-off circle, a terrific penalty killer. And when he's confident, you got to watch out. It is some of the best hockey we've seen from Nick Watt. You might remember he scored that big overtime goal in Montreal during the playoffs a couple of years ago. He can step up. He's been a little streaky, but as he's gotten older and figured out how to be more consistent, I think that Nick Watt has been one of those guys truly stepping up for the team. And those are the guys who come to mind. There are others. There are guys up from the American Hockey League who have filled roles, and they're just trying to keep the ship afloat, play structured, responsible hockey until those other guys I mentioned return to the lineup.
Now, with that, there's been a lot of complementary player additions that helped the team win the Stanley Cup. One of them notably a former New York Ranger, Brett Howden. But I want to know, for players like Ivan Barbashev, Chandler Stevenson, Howden, what in Vegas in such a short amount of time period has allowed players like that to develop and flourish? Like, what was set up maybe at the start or the dawn of the franchise that's allowed players to step in and develop and almost take their game to another level? I think a lot of clubs struggle with that, and they've been around for a long period of time. One of those clubs, the New York Rangers. So what's allowed players to go to Vegas and, like you mentioned with Nick Roy, take their game to another level?
It's a great point, Matthew, because growing up in New York, you think about the big trade line acquisition, the superstars, whether it's in hockey or baseball, you go through it all. And, people in New York want the superstar. The Golden Knights have acquired a couple of those. Alex Pietrangelo, Cup champion captain in St. Louis. He's a horse. He might not be the guy who wins the Norris every year, but he ought to probably get more consideration than he does because he can put offense first if he needs to. On the Golden Knights, he doesn't need to, but he does put defensive hockey first, and the number of minutes he plays, he doesn't have to play 25 minutes. He can. They've moved him to the second power play because they don't need him on the first power play, and it doesn't matter to him. He's just a great leader, an experienced guy who's great in the room, a great family guy. So he's a star. Jack Eichel is a star, but You mentioned Ivan Barbashev. You mentioned Chandler Stevenson. Now, Ivan, yes, had won the Stanley Cup with the Blues a few years back, but the Knights didn't have somebody of his pedigree, someone who was physical, tough, but also has the skill to be a top-line player. And what do you know? He's there with Jack Eichel and Jonathan Marchessault, and he made Riley Smith expendable. The Golden Knights and their fans love Riley Smith, an original Golden Knight, but with his age and contract, the Knights needed to find some salary cap space to keep Ivan Barbashev and sign him to an extension. That was a tough choice to make, but the Knights didn't have somebody like Barbashev. They didn't have somebody like Chandler Stevenson, who was acquired from Washington, again, Cup champion, beat Vegas in 2018, but then the Knights got him. I remember talking with Jay Beagle, who had been a line mate with Chandler Stevenson on that Cup team in Washington, and I asked him, did you think that Chandler would turn into this great all-star type player, point per game type of guy with the Golden Knights? And he said, oh, I knew it back in Washington. I just didn't tell anybody because then they would take him off of my line. So Jim McKenzie is a Golden Knights scout. He had seen Chandler and Hershey. I remember seeing Chandler and Hershey in the American League, and you could see he had this incredible speed and incredible lower body. But could he put it together at the NHL level? And Jim McKenzie saw something there. And so the Knights got him, for pennies on the dollar, essentially. And he has just blossomed into this guy. So the theme in all of this, going back to the start of the franchise, players who were deemed expendable by their clubs for whatever reason, let them come to Vegas. And that's where the misfit mentality came to life. The team created that. The players created that, not the front office, not the marketing department. It was James Neal, an original Golden Knight, had the group chat with all the players, and they named the group chat Golden Misfits. And that eventually came out. The line of Smith, Carlson, and Marchessault, which came together that first year, the Knights' top line for a while, and then resurrected again with each three the head coaches the Knights have had. They've all come back to those guys, in Gerard Gallant, and then Pete DeBoer, and then Bruce Cassidy at different stages. But that misfit mentality is so important to the team because even for Bruce Cassidy, you look at the starting lineup, Game 5, Stanley Cup final. Mm-hmm. There are 6 original misfits on the roster. You can only put 5 in a starting lineup, but all of those 5 were original Golden Knights, the misfits from year one. People in Las Vegas, many are from not Las Vegas, including myself. People go there for an opportunity, like myself, and look for a new start. And in some way, shape, or form, they're leaving something else behind. It didn't work out elsewhere. And that mentality for the players, a lot of people in Las Vegas, I think, have that same belief. Vegas born was something that the organization has trumpeted, that the organization didn't relocate from elsewhere. There's no prior history. They started in Vegas. The community fell in love with them. There was the awful tragedy on October 1st, the 58 lives that were lost, and the Golden Knights team and the players were there to help heal the community before they ever played a regular season game. And then they have this incredible start, and it helped heal that city, and that has been a mutual love affair ever since. So the Vegas-born misfit mentality started back then, and it continues now to see players who have really thrived. And it's a long-winded answer to your great question, Matthew, but I think that really is the identity of the Golden Knights. And each of the guys who've come, including the stars like Pietrangelo, like Eichel, they have a need, a desire to understand that mentality so that they can embrace it and then be part of it themselves.
I love that. Actually, to build off that, is the vibe the same? I think a lot of fans are curious to know, and I'm curious myself. Is the vibe the same as the first year you were there?
I don't think it'll ever be the same.
Okay.
But I think that a lot of folks felt with Bruce Cassidy being in his first year with the Knights, there was a refresh that obviously the Knights as an organization thought was needed. And Bruce Cassidy had been to the finals and lost. They lost to St. Louis and Boston in 2019 to Pietrangelo and Barbashev. So Bruce Cassidy was looking for that fresh start. I remember, and I spent a lot of the summer in Cape Cod in Massachusetts, so I know a lot of Boston fans. And fans were so upset, they thought they should have changed the general manager, not the coach. But so Bruce Cassidy, who had grown up a Bruins fan in Ottawa, he's in that same mode, that misfit mentality. They didn't want me? Fine, I'll go win a championship elsewhere. And he did. So I think that there was a feeling around the organization. There was a refresh there and a back to the mentality of, and I think that this was put really well by John Stevens, who, been part of the Kings run, Flyers coach, et cetera, just a great defensive coach. John Stevens has said, and I think it's a great way to sum everything up for a guy who understands that mentality, but is now coming from the outside in. On the Golden Knights roster, everyone feels important. You've got your stars. You've got Conn Smythe winners. You've got original misfits. You've got new arrivals. Everyone feels important. I'm not sure that other teams in the NHL can say that. I mean, with no disrespect to guys who play for the Edmonton Oilers. Do you feel as important as Connor McDavid and Leon Draisaitl if you're there? I don't know. Maybe they've figured something out with a new coach, and they've had this great winning streak. But I think that goes back to your original question, Matthew, about the identity of the team, and it's got to be a group. There's that common bond where you were cast off by somebody else, but everyone does feel important, and I think Bruce Cassidy has helped instill that to get the most out of players. And I remember saying this a lot about John Cooper, who I mentioned earlier, had been in Syracuse, and look at all the success he's had with that organization in Tampa. He knows how to push people's buttons. Today, Matthew might need a pat on the back. Steve, you might need a kick in the rear end. But tomorrow could be the other way around, right? John Cooper has those relationships with guys where he knows how to get the most out of them. It doesn't mean they're best friends. It doesn't mean that you've got to be buddy-buddy with everybody and stroke their egos. But it does mean that you know how to get the most out of a guy and help him grow as a player and as a person. And that's the neat thing. Jack Eichel and Bruce Cassidy, both, Jack had already been with Vegas, but was coming off the injury and hadn't really had a full season of preparation and training before he came in last year with Bruce Cassidy. So they kind of shared that. They talked about that. Bruce has talked about how, he said to Jack that summer before Bruce took the reins with Vegas, we're going to be lumped together. Let's figure it out. And boy, Jack has become, I think, a Selke candidate because now he's on the penalty kill. He is right there among the league leaders in takeaways. That was not Jack Eichel with the Buffalo Sabres. That's a direct result of Bruce Cassidy. And again, everyone feels important. Everybody's got to contribute. The stars are not up here and everybody else is down here. Everybody's part of it. And to your question, I think that's just such a big part of what has made this team go. And that's something that if they can keep it up, they are still in this window where they should be competitive this year and going forward.
Now, for the Rangers fan who don't follow the Knights frequently, who's hot right now for this Knights team that Ranger fans should really keep an eye on coming into this matchup?
I mentioned earlier Jonathan Marchessault, who can be streaky. He's now the team lead in goals. I mentioned Nick Waugh. He's got 5 points in the last couple of games. Ivan Barbashev. So that line has been terrific. You got to watch out for those three. The other guy I don't think I've yet mentioned is Pavel Dorofeev. That's Pavel, easy enough. Dorofeev, who's from Russia. His English is coming along. And I asked him about Ivan Barbashev. What makes Barbashev such a great guy to have on the team? And he said he speaks Russian. Those guys are great. They really get along, and they're fun components in the room. Ivan's English is excellent. It's better than a lot of people whose native language is English, grammatically speaking. Pavel's coming along, but he's hot. I asked Ivan Barbashev about Pavel before the game against the Islanders the other day, and that's exactly what Barbashev said. He's hot, and he has found himself playing with Chandler Stevenson and Mark Stone. Who wouldn't want to play with those guys? But you've got to finish. You can have your chances, but this is the NHL. It's not about feeling good about yourself. It's about production. And Pavel was, often a healthy scratch. The guys who have been in the lineup were guys who helped the team win a Stanley Cup. And then you have to wait for your opportunity, even if it means for sitting. Even though he hasn't done anything wrong, Bruce Cassidy is loyal to the guys who helped him get there. So Pavel has now gotten the opportunity with a number of injured players. Can you seize the opportunity? And he is. And a lot of that is coming from, attacking the net, being near the net, but also being responsible on the defensive side of the ice. you're out there with one of the great defensive players in the game, defensive forwards in the game, in Mark Stone. And Mark seems to rub off on whoever's on his line. And I think that Pavel is definitely in that spot. I'll also throw in, I think Alex Pietrangelo and Alec Martinez, that D pair has in the last week or so, with the exception of the game against New Jersey when Vegas gave up 6 goals, I think that that's a key thing to keep an eye on. Those guys know that it's defense first and offense comes from it. The quick puck retrievals, they're so good supporting the goaltender. And the last guy I'll mention is the returning goaltender, Aiden Hill, who missed 25 games, tried to come back a couple of times, didn't work. And what do you know? Makes 40 saves on 42 shots against the Islanders, was compact. He's big, lets the puck hit him. He can make a highlight save if he needs to, but his effectiveness is being compact, staying in the crease. And he looked against the Islanders like a guy who's been on a hot streak rather than a guy who hasn't played a full game since November.
Now, Dan, I want to chime in here and ask, you're a North Jersey guy like us. Now that you're around here, is it pretty cool to be able to come home? And you mentioned how you would, at the Meadowlands, talk to the announcers. Is it cool the other night to be in that booth calling a hockey game?
I wish it was the Meadowlands, which has been gone now for 16 years. The Devils moved to Newark in 2007. That's the wistful nature of it, Matthew, where I wish I could do a game in that building, even though it's still standing. Of course, the Devils haven't played there in 16 years. But to go to Madison Square Garden, that is special. Even as a Devils fan growing up, there's no place like MSG. It is the world's most famous arena. When I was younger, Marv Albert was doing the Rangers on radio. Of course, now it's been Kenny Albert for, almost 30 years. Boy, don't tell Kenny I rubbed in how old he is. But, between Kenny and Sam Rosen and Marv Albert, and I mentioned, Doc Emmerich and Matt Loughlin on Devils Radio for a long time now. And, of course, Howie Rose has done the Islanders. And, Brendan Burke is a friend of mine. We're contemporaries. And Chris King on Islanders Radio now. It's great to see a lot of the people. And I apologize. I'm sure I've just left somebody out. But it's great because I've known a lot of these guys for a long time and looked up to so many of them for a long time. And that's neat to be in that position. I'm grateful for all of that. We've been blessed with great play-by-play announcers in the New York area for many, many decades, back to the beginning of the broadcast play-by-play medium coming to existence. And we'd be here all day if you wanted to talk about that. So I'm just delighted to have relationships with these folks, and then to see them in person. We only see the Devils twice a year, the Islanders twice a year, the Rangers twice a year. So I try to make the most of that. And then, see some friends and family. And, it was neat. I was home for Christmas and got to bring home that Stanley Cup championship ring, which is unbelievable. And I never really thought about that as someone who wanted to, first play sports and then broadcast sports. The players and the coaches win a championship. I just talk about it. So I was in disbelief when they told me that, you're getting the same ring as the players and the coaches. And, that was special. But it was even more special to then share that with family and friends, especially around the holidays. And I know I'll get to show that ring to some folks here while we're in New York and New Jersey. And then, I talked earlier about Duva, my last name, D apostrophe, capital UVA, and my grandfather would come over from Italy, and it's got the apostrophe on that Stanley Cup ring. He would be very proud.
That's awesome. I love to hear that. I played travel hockey at Montclair, so more the Nutley neck of the woods. And I was curious to know, you bring that ring with you. You get any? What's your favorite pizza spot around there or restaurant?
Oh boy, gee whiz. That's a tricky one. There's Ray's Pizza in Nutley was always a favorite. There was a pizza place in Nutley that no longer exists, but it was for anybody who grew up in Nutley, you would know, Kingsland Avenue, the old Hoffman LaRoche factory, and I went to Spring Garden Elementary School. And there was a place called New York Pizza. There was a place called the Corner Deli. And you'd walk to school, walk to the pizza spot, and we'd get pizza there every Friday. And my dad, I think, single-handedly put them out of business because they refused to accept one of his coupons. If he collected 10 coupons, you got a free pie, and they refused to take one of them for some reason. And my dad was influential, I think, in the Nutley American Little League back then. They changed hands. That place was gone within a year. They make great pizza, though. I'd be here all day talking about food here in North Jersey, but yeah, the one that comes to mind is probably Ray's in Nutley. That would be the first one at the top of mind.
Well, Dan, I really appreciate that you came on to talk about the Vegas Golden Knights. Well, listen, I may see you at the Garden on Friday. I'll be there for sure, and
Great.
Look forward. I'm right under the away booth, so I will likely hear your voice right behind me while I'm on press row there.
I'll try not to screw up then.
Now, listen, with the way you spoke on here, you'll be in a good spot with the apostrophes in the right places and all. And yeah, thank you so much for coming on. I really appreciate that you hopped on in such short time notice.
Oh, I appreciate it so much, guys. It's wonderful to talk about hockey. You guys are passionate for it. Keep it up. It makes the game strong, and it's always fun to be in a conversation with people who love the sport, love talking the sport as much as those of us who have been around it for a long, long time. So keep it up.
Thank you very much for joining us again. Local person, so it's always great, that we can resemble on that. And this will wrap us up here on this episode of Puck Talk CS. Follow us along on our Instagram at Puck Talk CS, our website as well. You can find all our content. Re-listen to this fantastic episode. Always remember, it's just the luck of the puck.